A small town's silence can sometimes be the loudest sound of all. In Brookfield, New Jersey, the kind of place where neighbors waved from porches and children biked freely down shaded streets, that silence became deafening on the evening of September 26, 2006. It began as a night like any other. But by morning, it would unravel into one of the most haunting mysteries the town had ever known: the sudden disappearance of a 17-year-old girl whose life was full of promise, laughter, and ordinary teenage dreams. As we open this case file together, remember to like and subscribe to the Cold Case Archive, so stories like this are never forgotten. Claire Jennings wasn't a girl anyone in Brookfield could easily overlook. Standing just under 5'6", with sandy brown hair she usually pulled into a messy ponytail and an infectious smile that lit up the high school hallways, she seemed destined for more than her small-town life. Friends described her as dependable, the kind of person you could call at 2 a.m. if your car broke down or if you just needed someone to listen. Teachers admired her determination. She wasn't the straight-A perfectionist, but she worked hard, carried a part-time job at Brookfield Diner, and had already talked about applying to nursing programs after graduation. On September 26th, Claire was last seen leaving her best friend's house just before 10 p.m. She had been helping study for a biology exam scheduled later that week. Her friend remembered her cheerful mood that night, noting that Claire wasn't stressed, wasn't upset, and had mentioned nothing unusual. "See you tomorrow," were the last words she said before walking out into the cool autumn night. She never made it home. When midnight came and went without Claire's return, her parents grew anxious. At first, they reasoned she might have stayed longer with her friend. But calls to her phone went straight to voicemail. By sunrise, with no word from her daughter and no trace of her car in the driveway, Claire's mother knew something was wrong. She and her husband contacted the Brookfield Police Department. What began as a missing persons report quickly escalated into a frantic search. Later that same day, officers located Claire's car on a lonely stretch of Brookfield Road, a two-lane passage that cut through wooded farmland. The vehicle was pulled neatly onto the shoulder as if parked intentionally. Inside, investigators found her purse, wallet, school books, and phone. Nothing had been taken. There were no broken windows, no signs of a struggle, no evidence the vehicle had been forced open. To detectives, it was as if Claire had stepped away from her life in mid-sentence. But one item stood out immediately: a silver ring resting on the driver's seat. It was simple, almost ordinary, but its presence carried an eerie weight. On the inside of the band, an initial was engraved, the letter K. Claire's parents didn't recognize it. Neither did her closest friends. The ring didn't belong to Claire, and detectives couldn't immediately trace its origin. It was, from the very beginning, both the most significant and most frustrating clue in her disappearance. News of the missing teenager spread fast. Brookfield wasn't a place where such stories belonged. People here worried about late mortgage payments, Friday night football, and the occasional storm that knocked out power lines. A missing girl, and a mystery ring, were the stuff of television shows, not their hometown. And yet, reality was inescapable. The Jennings family became the public face of the tragedy. Claire's mother appeared on local television stations, pleading for her daughter's safe return. "Claire, if you can hear this, please know we love you. Please come home." Her father organized search parties that covered miles of woodland and farmland. Neighbors, classmates, and even strangers showed up, combing through fields with flashlights, holding posters bearing Claire's photograph, smiling, full of life. The Brookfield Police Department, though small, mobilized all available resources. They requested assistance from county investigators and coordinated with nearby towns. Bloodhounds were brought in to track any possible scent from Claire's car. Helicopters circled overhead, scanning tree lines. Dive teams searched nearby rivers. But every effort returned the same heartbreaking result: nothing. In those early days, hope ran high, but so did fear. Parents kept their children closer. Conversations in grocery stores and coffee shops turned to theories. Had Claire run away? Had she been abducted by someone passing through? Or was the truth closer to home, hidden in plain sight? Detectives turned their attention to those who knew Claire best. They started with her boyfriend, Daniel Rhodes. By all accounts, Daniel was devastated by her disappearance. He sat through hours of questioning, answering every detail about his whereabouts. On the night Claire vanished, he had been at a friend's house with several others who vouched for him. Detectives noted his grief seemed genuine. His alibi held. Next came Claire's ex-boyfriend, Kevin Hartley. Kevin had dated Claire the previous year, and the relationship ended on rocky terms. Friends described him as jealous, easily angered, and still fixated on her long after they split. To investigators, Kevin became an immediate person of interest. And when the ring was discovered with an engraving of K, suspicions sharpened. But in those first weeks, there was no definitive evidence against Kevin. No fingerprints on the ring, no eyewitness accounts placing him near her car, nothing tangible to hold him with. He denied any involvement and claimed he hadn't seen Claire in weeks. Still, whispers began to spread through Brookfield. Some pointed to his history of temper. Others said the police were grasping at straws. Then a local resident, Robert Finch, came forward. On the night Claire vanished, he had been driving home when he noticed a girl who resembled Claire standing near a silver pickup truck on Brookfield Road. He claimed she was arguing with a man, though he couldn't see his face clearly in the dark. To investigators, this was the first possible sighting of Claire after leaving her friend's home. The detail of the silver truck lingered in their minds, but without more, it wasn't enough to make an arrest. As weeks turned into months, the case grew colder. The Jennings family kept hope alive, holding candlelight vigils at the high school football field, organizing prayer circles, and urging law enforcement not to give up. Students wore ribbons on their backpacks. Teachers left Claire's desk empty, often adorned with flowers. But hope was gradually overshadowed by a grim reality. Statistically, missing persons who remain unfound after the first 48 hours face a dramatically reduced chance of survival. Behind closed doors, detectives admitted what the Jennings family could not bring themselves to say out loud. They feared the search was no longer for a missing girl, but for a body. The silver ring, the abandoned car, the eerie absence of clues, everything about Claire's disappearance was both unsettling and incomplete. The investigation had barely begun, but already it was slipping through the cracks. And as Brookfield settled into a heavy silence, detectives started to focus on one possibility, that the engraved letter K was no coincidence. Someone close to Claire might know more than they were saying. And soon, suspicion would fall on a familiar face. When a case begins with so little evidence, investigators often turn their eyes toward the people closest to the victim. In Brookfield, New Jersey, the disappearance of 17-year-old Claire Jennings was no exception. With her car neatly abandoned, her belongings intact, and only a mysterious silver ring to show for it, detectives were left to ask the most uncomfortable question of all. Did someone Claire trusted have a hand in her vanishing? The Jennings family sat through countless interviews in those first weeks. Claire's parents were desperate, their grief visible in every word. They insisted their daughter had no reason to run away, no reason to vanish on her own. Detectives pressed them about Claire's relationships, her friends, and her personal life, hoping some small detail might reveal the truth. And two names kept surfacing: Daniel Rhodes, her boyfriend, and Kevin Hartley, her ex. Daniel Rhodes had been dating Claire for several months before she disappeared. By all accounts, theirs was a typical teenage romance. They spent weekends at the movies, studied together for exams, and Daniel often picked Claire up after her shifts at Brookfield Diner. But detectives knew better than to take appearances at face value. Statistically, intimate partners are among the first considered in cases of sudden disappearance or foul play. Daniel was brought in for questioning within days of the discovery of Claire's car. Sitting in a cramped interview room at the Brookfield Police Department, he appeared pale, tired, and shaken. He explained that on the night of September 26th, he had been at a friend's house with several others, watching a football game. One by one, those friends confirmed his story, placing him miles away from Brookfield Road when Claire went missing. Detectives found his answers consistent, his demeanor sincere. Still, the tension in his voice revealed the weight of suspicion. "I'd never hurt Claire," he told them, fighting back tears. "I loved her." Although his alibi seemed solid, detectives weren't ready to cross him off their list entirely. They quietly continued to monitor Daniel's movements, phone records, and social connections. But for the time being, their focus began to shift toward someone else: Kevin Hartley. Kevin wasn't just another name in Claire's life. He was her ex-boyfriend, a presence that lingered long after their breakup. Friends described their relationship as intense, full of highs and lows, laughter and arguments that often escalated in public. Claire had confided to a close friend that Kevin's jealousy sometimes frightened her, especially when he accused her of spending too much time with other boys. Even after they split, Kevin would show up at the diner where Claire worked, sometimes sitting in the corner booth watching. Detectives called him in for questioning. Kevin walked into the police station with a calm expression, insisting he had nothing to do with Claire's disappearance. He claimed he hadn't seen her in weeks and that he had been home the night she vanished. But something about his composure raised eyebrows. Unlike Daniel, whose grief seemed raw and uncontrolled, Kevin was almost too steady, too practiced in his answers. When detectives confronted him with the discovery of the silver ring, engraved with the letter K, Kevin denied it belonged to him. He insisted he had never owned such a ring. Investigators couldn't tie it directly to him, but the coincidence gnawed at them. Behind the scenes, rumors in Brookfield began to spread like wildfire. At the grocery store, in the school parking lot, in whispered conversations at church, people spoke of Kevin's temper, his jealousy, and his lingering obsession with Claire. To many, the silver ring was all the proof they needed. But in the eyes of the law, suspicion was not enough. Evidence was. And for now there wasn't enough of it. Then came a potential breakthrough. A local man named Robert Finch stepped forward with a statement. On the night of September 26th, as he drove along Brookfield Road around 10:30 p.m., he noticed a silver pickup truck pulled off to the side. Standing near it was a young girl who looked strikingly like Claire Jennings. Robert recalled seeing her in what appeared to be a heated argument with a man. The darkness and distance made it impossible to clearly identify the male figure, but Robert's memory of the silver truck burned into his mind. To investigators, this was the first real eyewitness account connecting Claire to another person after leaving her friend's house. And combined with what they already knew about Kevin, his history of conflict with Claire, his jealousy, his denial about the ring, suspicion began to harden into something more substantial. Detectives quietly began to scrutinize Kevin's life. They interviewed his friends, checked his background, and kept close watch on his routine. But once again, the lack of direct evidence worked in his favor. There were no fingerprints on the ring, no confirmed sightings placing him at the scene beyond Robert Finch's testimony, and no forensic evidence linking him to Claire's abandoned car. Still, the whispers in town grew louder. Parents warned their daughters to avoid Kevin. Students whispered in hallways. Every glance, every rumor, every mention of his name seemed to deepen the cloud of suspicion hanging over him. But the justice system requires more than whispers. And until detectives had more, Kevin remained free. Meanwhile, the Jennings family watched as suspicion circled but answers never came. Claire's mother admitted she struggled with conflicting emotions. On one hand, she wanted to believe the police would find her daughter alive. On the other, she couldn't ignore the possibility that someone she knew, someone who once claimed to love Claire, might be responsible. "It's like living in a nightmare," she told reporters. "Every day I ask myself, who knows the truth and why won't they tell it?" As fall turned to winter, the investigation slowed but never stopped. Detectives chased every lead they could find. But one by one the trails ran cold. The only constants were the abandoned car, the mysterious silver ring, and the gnawing suspicion that Kevin Hartley was hiding something. By December, the Brookfield Police Department faced growing pressure. The community demanded answers, the Jennings family begged for closure, and local media ran headlines that cast shadows of doubt across Kevin's name. But without new evidence, detectives could do little more than circle the same theories, hoping time would eventually break the silence. And then, just when it seemed the trail had gone cold forever, nature itself intervened. Because in the quiet woods beyond Brookfield, something was waiting to be found. For 3 long months, Brookfield lived in a state of suspended grief. Claire Jennings was still missing, the investigation had slowed to a crawl, and suspicion alone wasn't enough to bring answers. Her car remained an impound, the silver ring sat sealed in evidence, and every lead detectives chased seemed to end in dead ends. But on a cold morning in January 2007, the silence broke, and with it, the Jennings family's last fragile hope. It began with a pair of hikers cutting through the wooded expanse of Pine Hollow Reserve, a rugged nature area just beyond the edge of town. The reserve stretched for miles, its trails popular in summer but lonely in the winter months. The hikers, bundled against the chill, strayed off the main path, drawn by the frozen stillness of the forest. What they stumbled upon would change the course of the investigation forever. Half buried in a shallow grave, concealed by leaves and frost, were human remains. The scene was grim. Detectives rushed to the site, sealing off the area with yellow tape. Forensic teams worked with painstaking care, documenting the grave, photographing every detail, and collecting soil samples. Among the skeletal remains were fragments of clothing that matched the description of what Claire had been wearing the night she vanished. A necklace her mother had given her for her 16th birthday was found tangled among the bones. The Jennings family's worst fears were confirmed within days. The remains belonged to Claire Jennings. News of the discovery spread through Brookfield like wildfire. For some, it brought a grim kind of relief. At least the uncertainty was over. But for the Jennings family, grief turned sharper. Their daughter had not run away, had not vanished into some unknown life. She had been taken and she had been killed. And now, more than ever, the community demanded justice. Detectives pored over the crime scene evidence. The shallow grave suggested haste, not planning. Whoever buried Claire wanted her hidden, but not found. Soil samples showed signs of disturbance consistent with late September, around the time she disappeared. And then there was the location itself. Pine Hollow Reserve was a known hangout for local teenagers, including Claire and her circle of friends. Whoever chose this spot may have been familiar with it. The discovery reignited suspicion around Kevin Hartley. Detectives couldn't ignore the mounting circumstantial evidence. The silver ring with the engraved K. The eyewitness account of a silver pickup truck. Kevin's turbulent history with Claire. And now, her body found in a location both of them had likely visited before. But every time the case leaned toward Kevin, the evidence pushed back. No fingerprints on the ring. No DNA strong enough to survive years in the elements. And in 2007, forensic science had limitations investigators couldn't overcome. Technology that might one day unlock hidden answers simply wasn't there yet. The lack of progress weighed heavily. The Jennings family gave interviews, their grief laid bare before cameras. Vigils were held again, this time in memory rather than hope. Brookfield High School dedicated the spring concert to Claire, the empty chair in the flute section a haunting reminder of what had been lost. Detectives revisited Robert Finch, the man who claimed to have seen Claire arguing with someone near a silver truck. They pressed him for more details, showed him photographs, even had him sit with a sketch artist. Finch insisted the girl he saw looked like Claire, and the man's build resembled Kevin Hartley. But he could never say with absolute certainty. Defense attorneys, detectives knew, would tear apart such shaky testimony in court. By the end of 2007, frustration gave way to resignation. With no forensic breakthroughs and no confessions, the investigation slowed. The Jennings family still came to vigils, still placed flowers at Pine Hollow, still pleaded for justice. But each passing day without answers made the silence heavier. The silver ring remained the most haunting piece of evidence. Detectives sent it to multiple labs, hoping for hidden fingerprints or trace evidence. Nothing. They traced local jewelers, pawn shops, and online sales, searching for any record of its purchase. Again, nothing. It was as if the ring had appeared from nowhere, existing solely to taunt investigators. By the end of 2008, the case was officially labeled cold. For the Jennings family, those words were devastating. Cold meant no new leads. Cold meant unanswered questions. Cold meant Claire's killer was still out there, living freely while their daughter lay in a grave at Pine Hollow. Yet even in cold cases, memory lingers. Each anniversary of Claire's disappearance brought fresh media attention. Each vigil reminded Brookfield of the silence that still hung over their town. Detectives, even when assigned to other cases, admitted they carried Claire's file in the back of their minds. For her parents, the grief never dulled. Her mother often returned to Claire's room, preserved as it had been the night she left. The posters on the walls, the books stacked on the desk, the half-finished homework. It's like she could walk through the door at any moment, she once said. But deep down she knew that moment would never come. The years stretched on, each one widening the distance between Claire's life and the possibility of justice. Leads dried up, witnesses faded into memory, and even the sharpest suspicions dulled without evidence. Kevin Hartley remained a free man, carrying on with his life, his name whispered in connection to the case but never legally bound to it. And so, Brookfield learned to live with the silence. A silence that was heavier than words, heavier than grief, heavier than truth. But silence has a way of breaking. Because in the years that followed, whispers began to surface. Rumors in prison yards, secrets shared in confidence. Whispers that would slowly breathe life back into Claire Jennings' cold case. Cold cases rarely vanish completely. They linger in dusty file boxes, whispered in police stations, and weighed heavy on the families left behind. For years, Claire Jennings' murder haunted Brookfield. Her parents marked anniversaries with vigils, detectives kept the case file on their shelves, and the silver ring with the letter K remained a silent question. But official progress stalled, and the town settled into uneasy silence. Until the whispers began. It started in 2012, 5 years after Claire's remains were found. A rumor surfaced from an unlikely place, the state prison system. An inmate serving time for burglary told guards that another prisoner, in casual conversation, had bragged about knowing what happened to Claire Jennings. According to the story, the prisoner claimed he once heard Kevin Hartley boast about getting rid of her. When word reached detectives, the Jennings case file was pulled back into focus. The rumor was maddeningly thin, but it couldn't be ignored. Investigators arranged to interview the inmate who reported it. Sitting across from him in the visitation room, they asked him to repeat what he'd heard. He described how Kevin, while in a holding cell years earlier, allegedly bragged about showing her she couldn't leave him. But when pressed, the inmate admitted he wasn't sure whether Kevin had been serious or just posturing to look tough. It was a frustrating dilemma. Jailhouse rumors are notoriously unreliable. Prison culture thrives on gossip, exaggeration, and sometimes pure fabrication. Inmates often offer stories in hopes of gaining leniency. Detectives knew they couldn't take the claim at face value. Without corroborating evidence, it was hearsay, legally useless. Still, the rumor reignited old suspicions. Detectives returned to Kevin Hartley's file, combing through interviews, alibis, and inconsistencies. They quietly re-interviewed some of his old acquaintances. A few recalled his possessiveness over Claire, his temper, and how he struggled to let go after their breakup. But none could provide the smoking gun investigators so desperately needed. For the Jennings family, hearing about the prison rumor was like ripping open an old wound. They went on record urging police to dig deeper, to not dismiss the lead as gossip. If someone knows something, they need to speak up, Claire's mother said in a televised interview. We can't live with silence forever. Years passed and still no progress. By 2015, nearly a decade had gone by since Claire was laid to rest. The ring remained a question. Kevin remained free. And Brookfield lived with the unspoken fear that justice might never come. But then in 2019, the silence cracked again. This time, the whisper came not from a prison yard, but from a man carrying the weight of conscience. His name was Stephen Cross, a construction worker who had once been part of the same social circle as Kevin Hartley. Stephen contacted authorities after years of silence, saying he had information about the night Claire disappeared. What he described sent chills through the cold case unit. Stephen claimed that on the night of September 26, 2006, he had seen Kevin and another man, later identified as Brian Keller, a longtime friend of Kevin's, struggling with what looked like a heavy object near the back of a silver pickup truck. The object, Stephen said, was wrapped in a dark tarp. The shape of it, the way they lifted it, the tension in their faces, he believed it was a body. At first, Stephen admitted he hadn't wanted to come forward. Fear, loyalty, and disbelief kept him silent. But over the years, guilt gnawed at him. Every anniversary, every news story about Claire's unsolved murder reminded him of what he had seen. It's haunted me for years, he told detectives. I should have spoken up sooner. Detectives listened carefully, their skepticism balanced with cautious hope. Stephen's account was detailed, consistent, and carried the weight of authenticity. But as always, they needed more than words. They pressed him for details, the location, the time, the truck, the clothes Kevin and Brian wore. Piece by piece, his story aligned with known facts. And for the first time in over a decade, the cold case warmed. As we continue through this case file, remember to like and subscribe to the Cold Case Archive. Your support helps keep these stories alive and ensures they're never forgotten. The new statement breathed life back into the investigation. Detectives pulled Kevin's file yet again, this time with sharper eyes. They tracked down Brian Keller, who had never been considered a serious suspect before. Brian's background revealed minor arrests for theft and disorderly conduct, but nothing violent. Yet his long-standing friendship with Kevin was undeniable. Investigators brought Brian in for questioning, hoping the pressure of time might crack him. At first, he denied everything. He claimed he hadn't seen Kevin the night Claire disappeared. He claimed he had no knowledge of Pine Hollow or any body. But as the interview dragged on, cracks began to show. His hands trembled when asked about September 26th. His eyes darted when detectives mentioned the silver pickup. And when pressed about Stephen Cross's account, Brian grew visibly agitated. Detectives exchanged glances. They could see it. Brian Keller knew more than he was admitting. Even without Brian's confession, Stephen's testimony was enough to reopen the case formally. Detectives reclassified it as active and began exploring new forensic avenues. Technology had advanced dramatically since 2007. Evidence that once yielded nothing could now be re-examined with techniques far more sensitive and precise. The silver ring was tested again, this time with cutting-edge DNA analysis capable of detecting even the faintest trace of skin cells. Soil samples from Pine Hollow, preserved in evidence, were subjected to updated methods. Even Claire's clothing fragments were carefully reanalyzed. The results would take months. But for investigators, the weight felt different this time. For the first time in years, they weren't chasing shadows. They were waiting on science. And those results, they knew, could be the missing proof they'd long been denied. For the Jennings family, hearing that the case was active again brought cautious optimism. They had been here before, moments of hope followed by crushing disappointment. But this time felt different. A new witness, new technology, and the growing possibility that the whispers in the shadows might finally give way to truth. Brookfield, too, stirred from its uneasy silence. Old wounds reopened. The case that had defined a generation was suddenly back in the headlines. For some, it was a painful reminder. For others, it was the first real chance at justice they had seen in years. Yet in the midst of hope, there was also fear. Fear that the trail might still go cold. Fear that whispers would remain whispers and nothing more. But the truth had already begun to surface. Because DNA results were coming, and once paired with a confession, they would finally crack open the silence that had lasted far too long. For nearly 13 years, the murder of Claire Jennings had loomed over Brookfield like a shadow. Vigils came and went. Rumors flickered and faded. And though suspicion clung to Kevin Hartley like smoke, no one could prove beyond doubt that he was responsible. The silver ring sat in its evidence bag like a riddle that refused to be solved. Pine Hollow remained a scar on the landscape, a reminder of the night Claire never came home. But in 2020, the silence finally cracked. It began with the forensic results that investigators had been waiting on since reopening the case. The evidence from Pine Hollow, Claire's clothing fragments, the soil samples, and most importantly, the silver ring, had been reanalyzed using modern DNA technology. Unlike the crude methods of 2007, these new techniques could capture even the faintest traces of genetic material, skin cells invisible to the naked eye, molecules that had clung stubbornly to metal and fabric for years. The results came back with a name: Kevin Hartley. The DNA was partial but consistent. Traces recovered from the inside band of the silver ring matched Hartley's genetic profile. For investigators, it was the break they had been waiting more than a decade to see. Suddenly, the ring wasn't just a haunting symbol, it was a direct link tying Kevin to Claire's disappearance and death. Detectives acted quickly. They secured warrants, searched Kevin's home, and quietly gathered new evidence. Old friends and acquaintances were re-interviewed. Patterns emerged. Kevin had never truly let go of Claire. Even after her death, he was known to bring up her name, to bristle when others suggested she'd moved on, to retreat into silence when the subject of Pine Hollow surfaced. But DNA alone wasn't enough. Prosecutors knew defense attorneys would argue contamination or coincidence. What they needed was testimony, someone who could tie the evidence to a confession. And that's when pressure turned to Brian Keller. Detectives brought Keller back in, armed with the new forensic results. This time they didn't ask vague questions. They placed the evidence photos in front of him. The ring, the grave at Pine Hollow, the DNA report. And then they leaned in. "We know Kevin's DNA was on the ring. We know Stephen saw the two of you moving something that night. Brian, this is your chance. Tell us what really happened." At first, Keller resisted. He denied everything, insisted Stephen was lying, accused detectives of twisting the facts. But as the hours dragged on, the weight of years pressed down. His breathing grew shallow. His hands shook. And finally, when faced with the possibility of being charged as an accomplice to murder, Brian Keller broke. The words came slowly, halting at first, then spilling faster as the dam of silence gave way. He admitted he had been with Kevin the night Claire disappeared. He admitted they had argued after she confronted Kevin about his jealousy and his threats. He admitted he had stood by as Kevin snapped, striking Claire in anger, silencing her screams. Detectives sat frozen for a moment, their pens hovering above their notebooks. In 13 years of chasing whispers, this was the first time they were hearing the truth laid bare. The room was heavy with silence. The kind of silence that comes when decades of doubt and suspicion finally crystallize into certainty. Then the scribbling began. Every word mattered. Every detail could close the gap that had haunted this case for so long. According to Keller, the violence wasn't planned. Kevin had lured Claire into his truck under the pretense of wanting to talk, to win her back one last time. The argument spiraled. Claire threatened to finally cut him out of her life. Kevin couldn't accept it. In a fit of rage, he killed her. Keller claimed he hadn't participated in the killing, but he confessed to helping Kevin afterwards. Racked with fear, loyalty, and confusion, he had helped load Claire's body into the truck. Together they drove to Pine Hollow, dug a shallow grave, and buried her beneath the leaves. And then came the detail that froze detectives in place. Keller admitted it was Kevin who left the silver ring. Not as a token of love, but as a twisted mark of ownership. Kevin had forced Claire to wear it during their relationship, a symbol of his control. Leaving it behind was his final act of dominance, a cruel reminder that even in death she belonged to him. The confession shattered the silence. After 13 years, the truth had been spoken aloud. Detectives documented Keller's statement meticulously, cross-referencing it with the known evidence. His description of the gravesite matched precisely with what forensic teams had uncovered in 2007. His timeline aligned with Claire's last known movements. His account of Kevin's temper and possessiveness echoed what countless witnesses had said for years. With Keller's testimony and the DNA results, investigators finally had the two pillars of a strong case: science and confession. On a cold morning in February 2021, police cars rolled up to Kevin Hartley's home. He was taken into custody without incident, though neighbors recalled the look on his face as one of bitter resignation. After years of rumors, whispers, and suspicion, Hartley was finally facing justice. News of the arrest electrified Brookfield. For some, it was vindication. The man they had long suspected was finally behind bars. For others, it was shock, a reminder that the friendly face next door could hide unimaginable darkness. For the Jennings family, it was a complex mixture of relief and renewed grief. Justice had taken so long, and yet it was finally at their doorstep. Kevin Hartley's trial began in 2023. The prosecution laid out the evidence piece by piece. They showed the jury the silver ring, described its significance, and revealed the DNA match that tied Hartley directly to it. They presented Stephen Cross's eyewitness account of seeing Kevin and Brian moving a body-like object. And most damning of all, they played recordings of Brian Keller's confession, in which he described Kevin's rage and the burial at Pine Hollow. Hartley's defense fought back fiercely. They claimed the DNA evidence was inconclusive, the eyewitness unreliable, and Keller's confession the desperate words of a man trying to save himself. They painted Kevin as a flawed but misunderstood man, someone who loved Claire too much, not someone who killed her. The courtroom was tense. Jurors leaned forward in their seats, taking notes, whispering quietly during recess. The Jennings family sat through every session, their faces a portrait of endurance. And on the final day, as the jury filed back into the courtroom, the silence was suffocating. The judge asked for the verdict. Seconds ticked like hours. Then the foreman stood, paper in hand, and read the words that Brookfield had been waiting to hear for nearly 2 decades. Guilty. On June 14, 2023, Kevin Hartley was convicted of the murder of Claire Jennings. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. When the verdict was read, the Jennings family wept openly in the courtroom. Claire's mother clutched her husband's hand, whispering, "It's over." Her father later told reporters, "We've waited so long to hear those words. Now we know she can finally rest." For Brookfield, the trial was more than just justice for Claire. It was a reminder that persistence matters. That whispers can become confessions. That silence can be broken no matter how many years pass. The case also served as a cautionary tale about jealousy, obsession, and the dangers of ignoring warning signs. Teachers, parents, and advocates in Brookfield began speaking more openly about the importance of recognizing controlling behavior in relationships. Claire's story became a rallying cry for awareness and prevention. And though the Jennings family will never have their daughter back, they were given something many families and cold cases never receive: answers. Claire Jennings' name was engraved not only on her headstone, but also in the memory of a community that refused to forget her. The silence had been broken. Justice had spoken. But the story did not end in the courtroom. It carried on, in the aftermath, in the lessons, in the legacy Claire left behind. The conviction of Kevin Hartley in June 2023 closed one of the darkest chapters in Brookfield's history. For nearly 2 decades, the town had lived under the shadow of uncertainty, suspicion, and grief. Now, with a guilty verdict delivered and Hartley sentenced to life without parole, the community could finally begin to breathe again. But the end of a trial does not mean the end of a story. For families, for investigators, for communities, the aftermath of a cold case stretches far beyond the courtroom. For the Jennings family, the verdict was both a moment of relief and an echo of sorrow. On the courthouse steps, Claire's father spoke with quiet dignity. Justice is not victory. It doesn't bring Claire back, but it gives us the truth, and the truth is all we ever wanted. Her mother described the years of waiting, of unanswered questions, of sleepless nights replaying the last time she saw her daughter alive. There were days I thought this moment would never come. But now we know who was responsible. Now we know she wasn't forgotten. In the months following Hartley's conviction, the Jennings family worked to channel their grief into purpose. They established the Claire Jennings Foundation, an organization dedicated to raising awareness about teen dating violence and emotional abuse. For them, Claire's story had to mean more than tragedy. It had to become a warning, a beacon, a call to action. Brookfield, too, was transformed. For years, Claire's case had been a hushed conversation, a reminder of how quickly innocence could be shattered. Now, with the truth revealed, the community embraced her memory openly. Schools invited advocates to speak about healthy relationships. Churches held vigils not just for Claire, but for other victims of violence. Her photo, once only seen on missing person posters, now appeared in tributes, yearbooks, and memorial slideshows. Her classmates, many now in their 30s, carried the memory too. At their high school reunion, a candle was lit in her honor. One former friend told local news, "Claire's life ended too soon, but her story will keep helping others long after." Local journalists reflected on how the case had tested their role. The coverage of Claire's disappearance, the years of speculation, the prison rumors, all of it showed how stories can shape memory. The Brookfield Chronicle ran a feature titled "Justice for Claire: What We've Learned," emphasizing the importance of persistence, patience, and the dangers of gossip. Law enforcement also carried lessons forward. The Bay County Sheriff's Office, which had inherited jurisdiction after regional restructuring, established a cold case unit inspired in part by the Jennings investigation. Detectives who had once filed Claire's case away in frustration now trained younger officers on the importance of revisiting evidence with fresh eyes and advancing technology. One detective put it simply, "The science caught up to the crime." That's the lesson. Never assume a case is over, because time and technology can change everything. The Jennings case became a landmark in policing circles. It demonstrated how a single witness could change the course of justice after years of silence, how gossip might stir suspicion but evidence must seal it, and how DNA, even partial and degraded, could unlock doors long thought closed. Cold case experts often say that time is both an enemy and an ally. Evidence deteriorates, witnesses die, memories fade. But time also brings advances in science, shifts in conscience, and the courage for people like Stephen Cross and Brian Keller to finally speak. In Claire's case, time did both, but ultimately, persistence tipped the balance. The human cost, however, is harder to measure. For the Jennings family, justice came at the price of years lost, birthdays uncelebrated, milestones missed. Claire would never walk at graduation, never pursue her dreams, never start a family of her own. Her empty seat at the dinner table remained a wound that no verdict could heal. Yet even in grief, there was resilience. Her family found ways to honor her memory in everyday life. Her mother kept her daughter's journal on the nightstand, rereading passages in Claire's looping handwriting. Her brother carried a photo of her at every major life event, ensuring she was symbolically present. Each year, on the anniversary of her disappearance, the family gathered at Pine Hollow, not to remember her grave, but to release balloons and speak of her laughter, her kindness, her dreams. Brookfield's annual Memorial Walk, once a solemn gathering, transformed into a celebration of life. Residents wore purple ribbons, a color chosen to symbolize both mourning and hope. The event raised money for domestic violence shelters, and the Jennings family walked at the front, holding a banner with Claire's face and the words, "Her story lives on." By the time Kevin Hartley was escorted into prison to begin his life sentence, Brookfield was already changing. Silence had turned into conversation. Whispers had become advocacy. And Claire Jennings, once just another name on a cold case file, had become a symbol of why these stories must never be forgotten. For every Claire, there are countless others still waiting for justice. Some cases linger in evidence rooms, others in the memories of those too afraid to speak. The Jennings case is proof that even after decades, truth can still be unearthed. The story of Claire Jennings is not just about a crime solved. It is about patience, persistence, and the resilience of a family who refused to let their daughter's name fade. It is about the dangers of jealousy disguised as love, the importance of recognizing control as violence, and the power of science to illuminate what time tried to bury. Most of all, it is about memory. For 17 years, Claire's story was one of silence. Now, through justice and remembrance, it is a story of truth. And as long as we keep her file open in memory, her voice will never be silenced again. This has been the Cold Case Archive. Thank you for joining us as we preserve these stories one file at a time. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that the memory of these cases lives on.